At 9 o'clock on the morning of November 25, 1942, General Georgy Zhukov stood in a command bunker near the town of Rzhev, 150 miles west of Moscow. He was 46 years old, the most celebrated general in the Soviet Union, and he was about to launch the largest offensive of his career. Outside, the temperature had dropped to minus 30 degrees. Snow covered the forests and frozen swamps of the Rzhev salient, a bulge in the German lines that had threatened Moscow for nearly a year. More than 700,000 Soviet soldiers waited in their positions, supported by 2,000 tanks and 1,000 aircraft. In Zhukov's hand was a decoded message from Stalin, Operation Uranus. The encirclement of the German 6th Army at Stalingrad had succeeded the previous week. Now it was Zhukov's turn. Operation Mars would destroy the German 9th Army at Rzhev and open the road to Smolensk. What Zhukov did not know, as he gave the order to attack, was that in the next 3 weeks, 335,000 of his soldiers would be killed, wounded, or captured. Operation Mars would become the greatest Soviet defeat of 1942, and for 50 years the Soviet government would pretend it never happened. The battle that history erased was about to begin. The warning had come from an unlikely source, German intelligence. 3 weeks earlier, on November 4th, 1942, Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, Chief of Foreign Armies East, presented his assessment to the German High Command. Gehlen was 40 years old, meticulous and rarely wrong. The Soviets are preparing 2 major offensives, Gehlen reported, one at Stalingrad, one at Rzhev. Both will strike in late November. 2 offensives, not one. That phrase would prove prophetic. And ignored. Hitler focused entirely on Stalingrad. The 6th Army was trapped and the Führer was obsessed with saving it. Rzhev was a secondary concern. General Walter Model, commanding the 9th Army at Rzhev, received no reinforcements and minimal intelligence updates. Gehlen protested. The forces gathering near Rzhev are massive, he warned. This is not a diversion. This is a major operation. No one listened. Hitler believed the main Soviet effort would be at Stalingrad. He was half right. There were 2 offensives, Uranus at Stalingrad and Mars at Rzhev. Uranus succeeded brilliantly. Mars would fail catastrophically. Model received Gehlen's report and filed it carefully. He would need every advantage. Unlike other German commanders, he believed the intelligence. He prepared his defenses accordingly. The trap was being set, but not by the Soviets. The Rzhev salient had been a wound in the Soviet front for nearly a year. In January 1942, the Red Army had driven the Germans back from Moscow in a desperate winter counter-offensive. But the advance had stalled, leaving a massive bulge in the German lines, a salient 100 miles wide and 60 miles deep, centered on the town of Rzhev. From this salient, the Germans threatened Moscow itself. Their artillery could strike Soviet supply lines. Their aircraft could bomb the capital. As long as Rzhev held, the victory at Moscow was incomplete. Stalin was obsessed with eliminating the salient. Throughout 1942, the Red Army had launched 4 major offensives against Rzhev. All had failed. Combined casualties exceeded 1 million men. Soviet soldiers called the salient the meat grinder. German soldiers called it the gateway to hell. Now, in November 1942, Zhukov planned the 5th offensive, the largest yet. Operation Mars was designed to mirror Operation Uranus at Stalingrad. 2 powerful thrusts would strike the base of the salient from north and south, cutting off the German 9th Army. A 3rd thrust would drive directly at Rzhev itself. If successful, 300,000 German soldiers would be encircled and destroyed. Zhukov assembled overwhelming forces. The Western Front under General Ivan Konev would attack from the east. The Kalinin Front under General Maxim Porkayev would attack from the north and west. Together, they commanded over 700,000 men, 2,000 tanks, 3,500 artillery pieces, and 1,000 aircraft. Against them stood General Walter Model's Ninth Army, approximately 200,000 men with 400 tanks. The Soviets had a 3-to-1 advantage in manpower and 5-to-1 in armor. On paper, Mars was an overwhelming force against a weakened enemy. Victory seemed certain, but Model was no ordinary commander. At 41, he was one of the youngest generals in the Wehrmacht and one of the most aggressive. Hitler called him "my fireman," the man sent to rescue hopeless situations. Model specialized in defensive warfare, in reading enemy intentions, in counterattacking at precisely the right moment. He had studied Soviet tactics for 18 months. He knew how Zhukov thought, and he had prepared a killing ground. 2 offensives, not 1. Galen had been right, but while Uranus would encircle an army, Mars would feed one into a meat grinder. Zhukov had prepared for Operation Mars with characteristic thoroughness. Since October, Soviet forces had been secretly concentrating in the forests around the Rzhev salient. Trains moved only at night. Troops marched without fires. Radio silence was absolute. Zhukov was determined that the Germans would have no warning. The plan was elegant in its ambition. The main attack would come from the north, where the 41st Army and the 6th Tank Corps would smash through German lines near the town of Bely. Simultaneously, the 20th Army would attack from the east toward the vital road junction at Sychevka. A third force, the 39th Army and the 1st Mechanized Corps, would strike from the southeast. The 3 attacks would converge behind Rzhev, trapping the entire 9th Army. "We will be in Rzhev within 5 days," Zhukov told his commanders at a final briefing on November 23rd. "Model's army will be destroyed before December." But the preparations had a fatal flaw. The Germans knew they were coming. Despite Soviet secrecy, German reconnaissance aircraft had spotted the troop concentrations. Local intelligence from Russian collaborators confirmed the buildup. Model knew the approximate timing, the approximate strength, and the approximate direction of the Soviet attacks. More importantly, Model understood Soviet doctrine. Zhukov would attack on multiple axes, expecting at least one to succeed. Model's response was to defend in depth. Multiple defensive lines, reserves positioned for counterattack, kill zones designed to channel Soviet armor into prepared positions. The frozen swamps and dense forests around Rzhev favored the defender. Soviet tanks would be forced onto narrow roads. Infantry would struggle through waist-deep snow. Artillery would have difficulty finding targets in the forests. Model had turned the terrain into a weapon. At 6 a.m. on November 25th, Soviet artillery opened fire along a 60-mile front. Operation Mars had begun. Zhukov expected breakthrough within hours. He was wrong. The first day revealed the magnitude of the disaster. At Belai, the 41st Army attacked into the teeth of prepared German defenses. Soviet infantry advanced through minefields that had been carefully concealed beneath the snow. German machine guns opened fire from bunkers invisible until the moment they began killing. The 6th Tank Corps, expected to exploit the breakthrough, found no breakthrough to exploit. By noon, the attack had stalled. Soviet casualties exceeded 10,000 men. In the east, the 20th Army fared slightly better. 2 rifle divisions penetrated the German first line near Sychevka. General Nikolai Kiryukin, commanding the assault, requested permission to commit his armor. Zhukov agreed. The 6th Tank Corps and the 2nd Guards Cavalry Corps were ordered forward into the breach. It was exactly what Model wanted. The German commander had deliberately allowed a shallow penetration at Sychevka. His reserves, the 9th Panzer Division and the Großdeutschland Division, waited on either flank. As Soviet tanks poured through the gap, Model ordered his counterattack. German armor struck the Soviet flank simultaneously. The breach that Kiryukin had thought was a breakthrough became a death trap. Within 48 hours, the 6th Tank Corps was surrounded, its tanks burning in the snow, its crews freezing to death beside their vehicles. Zhukov received the reports and refused to believe them. The offensive would continue. There was no alternative. 2 offensives, not one. At Stalingrad, victory. At Rzhev, slaughter. While Zhukov's offensive bled to death at Rzhev, Operation Uranus was achieving everything Mars had promised. On November 23rd, 2 days before Mars began, Soviet forces had completed the encirclement of the German 6th Army at Stalingrad. 300,000 German soldiers were trapped. Hitler refused to allow a breakout. The stage was set for the greatest German defeat of the war. The contrast could not have been starker. At Stalingrad, Soviet commanders had achieved surprise. At Rzhev, model had been waiting. At Stalingrad, Romanian and Italian troops had crumbled under the Soviet assault. At Rzhev, German veterans held firm. At Stalingrad, Soviet Tank Corps had raced through open steppe. At Rzhev, Soviet tanks burned in frozen forests. The difference was not in planning or resources. The difference was in the commanders they faced and the terrain they fought in. On November 28th, Zhukov ordered a second wave of attacks. The 1st Mechanized Corps, held in reserve, was committed against German positions near the town of Molodoy Tud. 700 tanks and 20,000 men advanced through a snowstorm into prepared German positions. The attack lasted 3 days. The 1st Mechanized Corps lost over 300 tanks. The German lines did not break. In Moscow, Stalin was growing impatient. He had expected Mars to match Uranus. Instead, casualty reports were arriving daily. 5,000 dead, 10,000 dead, 15,000 dead. The numbers were staggering. "What is happening at Rzhev?" Stalin demanded of his chief of staff. No one wanted to answer. On December 7th, Zhukov made one final effort. The 20th Army, reinforced with fresh divisions, would attack towards Rzhevka once more. Every available tank, every available gun, every available soldier would be committed. The attack began at dawn. By noon it had failed. German counterattacks had shattered the Soviet spearheads. Entire divisions had ceased to exist. Lieutenant Viktor Astafyev, a young officer in the 20th Army, survived the assault on December 7th. Decades later, he wrote about what he witnessed. "We attacked across an open field toward a village called Ovesishche. The Germans had zeroed their artillery on every meter of that field. Men were falling everywhere. I saw a company commander, a captain, stand up to rally his men. A shell landed beside him. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left. We kept attacking. There was nothing else to do." On December 11th, Stalin ordered Operation Mars suspended. The offensive had achieved none of its objectives. The Rzhev salient remained intact. Model's army had held. Zhukov flew back to Moscow in silence. He had never experienced a failure of this magnitude, and then something remarkable happened. Operation Mars disappeared. The cover-up began immediately. Soviet censors suppressed all mention of Operation Mars. War correspondents who had been assigned to cover the offensive were reassigned to Stalingrad. Casualty figures were classified. Unit histories were rewritten to minimize the losses. Within weeks, the official Soviet narrative had been established. There was no Operation Mars. There was only Operation Uranus, the glorious encirclement at Stalingrad. The fighting at Rzhev was described as local actions and diversionary attacks designed to prevent German reinforcements from reaching Stalingrad. It was a lie. Mars had been as large as Uranus, as carefully planned, as heavily resourced. It had simply failed. Zhukov cooperated fully with the cover-up. In his memoirs, published in 1969, he devoted hundreds of pages to Stalingrad and barely mentioned Rzhev. The offensive that had cost 335,000 Soviet casualties became a footnote, a supporting operation of minor significance. The soldiers who fought at Rzhev received no recognition. The dead were buried in unmarked graves. The survivors were transferred to other units and forbidden to discuss what they had witnessed. For 50 years, Operation Mars existed only in German records and in the memories of the men who had survived it. Then, in 1999, American historian David Glantz published Zhukov's Greatest Defeat, the first comprehensive account of Operation Mars based on declassified Soviet archives. The book revealed what the Soviet government had hidden for half a century. Mars was not a diversion, it was a catastrophe. The casualty figures were staggering. Soviet losses at Rzhev exceeded 335,000 men in 3 weeks, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Tank losses exceeded 1,700 vehicles. The 6th Tank Corps, which had begun the offensive with 180 tanks, ended it with 12. The 1st Mechanized Corps lost over 300 tanks in a single week. German losses were approximately 40,000 men, significant but sustainable. Model's 9th Army remained intact. The Rzhev salient would not be eliminated until March 1943, when the Germans voluntarily withdrew to shorten their lines. Operation Mars had achieved nothing except death. Georgy Zhukov never publicly acknowledged the failure of Operation Mars. In his memoirs, in interviews, in conversations with historians, he maintained the fiction that Mars was a secondary operation, a diversion designed to support the main effort at Stalingrad. He never accepted responsibility for the 335,000 casualties, but those who knew him well saw the change. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, who had coordinated both Uranus and Mars, noted that Zhukov never spoke of Rzhev willingly. It was the one subject he avoided, Vasilevsky wrote, the one battle he did not want to discuss. Zhukov died in 1974, his reputation as the greatest Soviet commander of the war intact. The truth about Mars remained buried in classified archives. Only after the Soviet Union collapsed did the full story emerge. Only then did historians understand what had happened in those frozen forests in November 1942. 2 offensives, not one. Galen had seen it clearly, Zhukov had planned it carefully, and history had recorded only the victory, not the defeat. General Walter Model, the defender of Rzhev, became one of the most celebrated commanders in the Wehrmacht. Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal in 1944. He was sent to stabilize crumbling fronts, France after D-Day, the Netherlands during Market Garden, the Ruhr Pocket in 1945. He never lost his reputation for defensive brilliance. In April 1945, trapped in the Ruhr with 300,000 men, Model refused to surrender. He dissolved his army, allowing soldiers to escape individually, then walked into a forest near Duisburg and shot himself. He was 54 years old. Zhukov survived the war and the peace that followed. He fell in and out of favor with Soviet leaders, celebrated, then exiled, then rehabilitated. He died in 1974 and was buried with full honors in the Kremlin wall. The soldiers who fought at Rzhev received their recognition only in 2007, when Russia unveiled a memorial at the site of the heaviest fighting. The inscription reads, "I was killed near Rzhev," a line from a poem by Alexander Twardowski that had preserved the memory of the battle when official history had erased it. History remembers Georgy Zhukov as the man who saved Moscow, encircled Stalingrad, and conquered Berlin. And he was all of those things. But history also forgot Operation Mars, deliberately, systematically for 50 years. The 335,000 casualties were erased. The failure was hidden. The dead were left in unmarked graves. Mars reveals an uncomfortable truth. Even the greatest commanders fail. Even the most careful plans collapse, and even victorious nations bury the battles they would rather forget. Zhukov won the war, But at Rzhev, in November 1942, he sent 335,000 men into a meat grinder and then pretended it never happened. Today, the forests around Rzhev are quiet. The trenches have been filled in, the bunkers have crumbled, but every spring, when the snow melts, farmers still find bones, Soviet and German mingled together in the earth. Search teams continue to recover bodies 80 years after the battle ended, but the lesson of Operation Mars endures. 2 offensives, not 1. Galen knew it, Model prepared for it, Zhukov launched it and lost. History records the victories, history forgets the defeats. But the dead remain, whether anyone remembers them or not. Some battles cannot be erased, no matter how hard the victors try. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Moscow to Montana, from historians to history lovers. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.